All right, we're here with Tom Luginbill from ESPN. Tom, thank you so much for being on the program.
Yeah, you bet, man. Glad to be here.
So you have a long history. I always like to ask people, how did you give us your superhero origin story. How did you get from high school kid to playing in the Arena Football League, all the coaching, all the way up to now, being part of ESPN?
Oh man, that how long do you have? I tell you, I was a four-year starter at quarterback in college, and ended up graduating from Eastern Kentucky. Got my master's degree from Marshall University, and during that time, I started coaching as a quality control guy in NFL Europe with Amsterdam. Then kind of dipped into the same spring league stuff with the Arena Football League while I was going through grad school. And I'd grown up the son of a college coach and had seen that end very, very badly. And I was like, you know what? I'm not sure I want to deal with those headaches and that side of things. So I really kind of steered my efforts towards pro football and player personnel. And at that time, NFL Europe was coming on. The Arena Football League was probably at its height. The first iteration of the XFL came along, and so I was able to have a lot of opportunities as a young assistant coach and a player personnel guy and a scout at a really really young age, and ended up becoming a head coach at the age of 25 in Arena Football too. Then moved on to the XFL. I was the quarterbacks coach for Los Angeles on our championship team in 2001. Then went on to move to work again in the Arena League as well as in the NFL with the Dallas Cowboys as a scout, and then kind of started to move into scouting full time. And when I made that decision, it was really around the time where all of a sudden the ESPN thing came into play, and myself and Todd McShay, handful of others, were working as a scouting group called Scouts Inc., and we had contracts with ESPN to provide content, behind the scenes content, things of that nature, and had an opportunity to jump on board full time. And within about 3 months or so of that happening, and again, so much of life is being in the right place at the right time. Um, they being ESPN, decided to launch ESPNU, which is going to be our all college based network. Right around that same time, they wanted to start covering high school recruiting from a scouting perspective, not so much a rumor mill, where is so and so thinking about going, or where is so and so going to be visiting, but more of a player personnel perspective of, what does the player bring, strengths, weaknesses, upside, where would we project this guy. And so 18 years later, here we are, and kind of grown, still maintain, I'm still our director of scouting and recruiting for ESPN and have been since 2005. Moved pretty heavily into the college football world as far as studio television and broadcasting games on Saturdays with ABC and ESPN. And then, of course, was part of XFL 2.0 in 2020. And here we are in 2023. So that's probably about as quick as I could give you a synopsis of the last 25 years or so.
So I mean, so let's go back to your days as a kind of Arena Football League player and even coaching in the XFL and then NFL Europe you were talking about. I mean, did you think that there was a market back then were you like, yeah, definitely this kind of all football world would work? I mean, these leagues kind of popped up, but then they kind of disappeared, and then now everything came back. So what was your thoughts? What was the thought back then of these leagues?
Well, there's no doubt there's a place for it. Now, my experience in arena football was a really, really good one, but I was also part of it and watched it grow into something that was unsustainable. The
Mm.
moment they went into a collective bargaining type of scenario, there's too much money going out the door and not near enough coming in, and ultimately it led to its collapse. And we haven't seen a resurgence of that version of the original Arena Football League since then. And my last I was a head coach at Detroit in 2003 and 2004, and our franchise just up and folded out of nowhere. One of the reasons why I moved into personnel full time. And then, with NFL Europe, it was, it started as the World League in 90 and 91, or 91 and 92. And then it came back in 95 as the World League. And then it changed to NFL Europe all the way through to the early 2000s. And then the XFL came along. And when the XFL came along, it was really attractive to essentially every great player, every good football player that was not on an active NFL roster to have a place to play. And they were paying well. There was a ton of exposure, obviously, with NBC. And at that time, there were also 2 cable affiliates, TNN and UPN. So you had 3 networks airing all of the games each and every week. My personal opinion on the first go around, and I know it takes a lot of criticism, but I've never talked to a single coach, scout, or player that was on any team during that time that didn't feel this same way. And that was that the football was not the problem. All right. The football players were not the problem. The presentation was the problem in terms of, feeling that need to have it couldn't just be football. There had to be a hook, and that ended up being wrestling and personalities and things of that nature. And I think it really damaged the league. Now, internally, if you ever went to one of those games in person, it was an awesome atmosphere. I mean, it was like a rock concert with a football game going on. So the in-game stadium experience was a completely different experience than one that was viewed on television. You fast forward to 2020, and now in 2023, they corrected the thing that needed to be corrected, right? The presentation of it, professional broadcasters, a professional look to it. In 2020, it was obviously ESPN and Fox. Now it's all ESPN and ABC and FX with us. But how it's presented on television is a big deal, and it matters because I think it gives it validity and it gives it credibility. And that wasn't something we had in 2001, no matter how good the football was. So, I mean, for example, we're in Los Angeles. I'm coaching the MVP of the league and Tommy Maddox, and the very next year, he's the NFL Comeback Player of the Year, and he takes the Pittsburgh Steelers to the AFC Championship game. We had 2 or 3 different guys on that roster that had Super Bowl rings. We had players on that roster that had 4 or 5 years vested in the NFL. These were good football players that still had some fuel left in the tank, and we saw that in 2020. We're going to see it now in 2023 going forward. I would say this about the need and the importance of having it is obviously it creates jobs, it creates opportunities. And football is a developmental sport, even when you're 23, right? I mean, the best of the best of the best are going to be playing in the National Football League. Doesn't mean you can't get there, but it might mean you need to play a little bit more. It might mean that you have to get 10 games under your belt of a bunch of tape for those teams to watch to maybe get you over the hump. And I feel firmly and strongly about this because when it relaunched in 2020 and just having been a part of the product on the field as a coach and being in stadium as a coach and then being on the other side of the camera, on the other side of the broadcast side of things, to see the rules and see how things were presented on television. If the pandemic hadn't hit, Mark, that thing would have skyrocketed. I mean, it was going in the right direction. And I think, Dwayne Johnson, I think Danny Garcia, I think the whole investment group saw that there was something there. It was working. It was good. People were receptive to it. But then the pandemic came along. So here we are 1 week away from the final game of the season. I joke with people all the time. I'm like, it's only taken 22 years for somebody to come and take our ring away from us, right? I mean,
that's true.
We've
true.
been defending this title. We've been defending this title since 2001, so it's going to be fun to see somebody else to take the mantle.
Yeah, I mean, I remember Oliver Luck. We're talking about the 2001. Oliver Luck, at least for the first year, was constantly saying, "We're not the same league. We're not going to have cheerleaders. This is not what," and he kind of laid that groundwork for the league to now that it's kind of separated. Now people don't really look at that, the XFL and from the 2001 to the version now. Now you were broadcasting games in 2020. Now you're into the 2023. Can you compare the 2 leagues at this point? I mean, you're right. I mean, everybody that I talked to within the XFL was like, that was a hit. Clearly, Fox knew that it was a hit too because they started their own football league. So they knew that it was there. What's the kind of comparison between the 2020 XFL and the 2023, aside from the ownership?
Yeah, I think it's very, very similar. I think the vision is very similar. They want to appeal to a very wide audience, young, old, male, female. The cities that they're currently in right now have been very, very receptive. And of course, just as in anything, if you win, people will show up. If you're playing well and you're a commodity, people are going to want to be a part of that. They're going to want to support that. So I think still in the infant stages there, the issue in all of this is, as it relates to the XFL, is they've never seen a season 2 yet, right? And I think that's what's going to be exciting about this going forward. And I'm not trying to put words in anybody's mouth, but the rules structure in 2020, which many of those carried over into 2023, they were a hit. They worked. People loved the access. They loved the audio. They craved the thing that college football and the NFL won't give you, right? And we're peeling back the curtain and talking with players in live action and coaches in live action, and the way the rules have sped the game up, yet not minimized, teams having opportunities to score and things of that nature. So instead of having a game that's 3 hours and 40 minutes, you have a game that's 2 hours and 43 minutes, right? And you're still getting all of the action. I think the kickoff rule is fantastic because it preserves the purity of the sport while making it more safe, because you do want to have returns. It's an exciting part of the game. The 3-tiered extra point system is incredibly unique. And it's interesting to note because I was a part of the 3rd overtime game this past weekend, the entire year, and the previous weekend were the other 2. So we had not had an overtime game until week 8. And the reason why that is because the different scoring opportunities, it makes it difficult to end in a tie. If you start to look at some of these games and some of these outcomes, especially the first 5 weeks of the season, you saw a lot of 26-19, 22-18, just because of how things played out. And so I think that's been a hit. And then maybe the most important thing, and I remember in 2020, there was a lot of pushback on this, the officiating side of things. The one complaint that I think fans have sometimes as it relates to the NFL or college football is at the end of a contest, right? At the end of the game, every player, every coach at some point has to stand at that podium and answer questions, right? They've got to be accountable. The officials are never put in that position. And so when it was presented that, the officials were going to be mic'd, you're going to listen in on conversation, there's going to be cameras in the press box, and you're going to see what the officials are looking at on a review, and you're going to hear them discussing it. Initially, I think on behalf of officials, there was a lot of pushback. Whoa, because they felt maybe they were going to be exposed. Well, guess what, Mark? The exact opposite happened. And what ended up happening was it created empathy. It created a different perspective on behalf of the fans. The fans, all of a sudden, instead of thinking everything is so black and white and the officials blew it and why don't they have to answer for it, they actually got to hear the interaction and the dialogue and started to realize, oh, wait a minute. Okay, I see how they came up with that now. Or, oh, wow, I didn't realize that A, B, C, D, and E all were part of the criteria. I thought it was just one of them. And what it did is it created an opportunity for a healthy respect, I think, to be developed for how difficult the job is of officials. And it is. And that part of it for me, like last week we had a scenario, we had an interception that should have been returned for a touchdown. And they called a block below the waist on the team returning it.
You talking about the DC Defenders game?
Yeah, the DC.
Yeah, I was there,
game.
and everybody was cheering, and then they were like, "Wait, what happened?"
So it was a block below the waist. All right. But if you watched what happened, and the guy should have never done it, but what he did is he's running in front of the defender. His returner is over here. He's running in front, and all of a sudden he just sits down. The guy like sits down and ends up taking out the guy behind him. He didn't block him, like he didn't go at his lower body, but he sat down and it ended up being below the waist. So of course, Dean Blandino, our VP of officiating, he's going to look at that. We're listening in, we're hearing him, and he says on there, he goes, yeah, we clearly have a block below the waist. And I'm looking at that, I'm going, well, it really wasn't a block. He just kind of sat down and the guy ran and tripped over him. And so we were able to immediately go, Dean, hold on a second. Can you give us some more clarity on that? Because that's not your traditional block. Next thing you know, he's on a 2-box with us. He's talking and he's explaining it, right? And so to have that access and have that interaction live in game, I think it's really, really good for the fans, and I think it's really helped officials.
It's been interesting to see Rod Woodson in particular. I love Rod Woodson. Won a Super Bowl with the Baltimore Ravens. I'm in Maryland, and he would always complain about the call or complain about Dean Blandino. But meanwhile, we all saw it, and he explained it, and we're like, okay, this makes sense. How is
Yeah.
the coaches kind of, because you hear them like, oh, I'm going to talk to Dean after the game or whatever.
Yeah.
How has that been going on behind the scenes?
Well, the problem is in game, and if you've ever coached, you've experienced this. Everything looks different in game. The coaches on the sideline don't get those 5 or 6 monitors and those 5 or 6 camera angles that Dean is looking at, and that he's rewinding and fast forwarding, and he's going slow mo, and then he's going full speed, and he's talking things through with the on field officials. The coaches just think that what they saw is what happened, and then they'll look up into the board of the stadium, and that
Hmm.
might only show one replay. It might only show one angle, and they'll go, "Look at that! It's that's clearly a penalty." But Dean's looking at 7 different angles, right?
Yeah.
And it's hard for the coaches to reconcile that on the field because emotion sets in, right? And everything matters so much and it's so important. And so, yeah, there's been a lot of conversations, I think, on Mondays and Tuesdays between Dean Blandino and the coaches when they have questions as to how did you come up with this? And then, of course, the league and Dean can say, okay, here's the angles that we had that you didn't see.
Mm.
And then it's a whole different conversation, and it should be. But the one thing that I thought that Dean and his staff have done a good job of, because this happened the first St. Louis and DC game in DC, there was a penalty that was no, it wasn't a penalty. It was a fumble. Okay, it was a fumble. I think something of that matter that either was or was not called a fumble. And Dean and his crew probably should have been reviewing that right on the spot so that they could make the call on it before remember, each one of these coaches has one challenge during the game
Yeah.
before the coach is forced to use his challenge, because if he's wrong again, he doesn't get it back, he loses the timeout. But what ended up happening is they didn't review it quickly, and so what happened, he used his challenge and he was right, but now his challenge is gone. So he shouldn't have had to use his challenge because they should have been looking at it upstairs. The
Yeah.
very next week, almost the exact same scenario happened, not in my game, but a game I was watching, and they corrected it. Dean was all over it. So now they didn't have to waste it. So, as with anything, coaches, players, officials, the offensive line, sloppy play, clean play, you don't have preseason games. You go on live television on week 1 and you improve each and every week.
Yeah. So what happened with the Bob Stoops using his challenge at the end of the DC Defenders game? Because
So
that
it
was
was
we were all like, wait, what happened?
Yeah. So the one thing, if you're not familiar, everybody gets you get one challenge per game,
Yeah.
but it doesn't have to be a challenge of a call that was made on the field or a penalty that was called. You can challenge anything. Like if you think something happened and they didn't see it, you can say, and that's exactly what Bob Stoops did. And I was in the booth when this happened because they were done. It was over. And
Yeah.
I blurted out, I said, challenge it. Challenge anything. Find something. Get your coaches upstairs looking at that play. Rewind that play on your tablet on the sideline. Find something. Anything. Well, what did they do? Bob Stoops says, we think Sal Cannella, number 80, our tight end, was held off the line of scrimmage, and it was a missed call. Sure enough, he was right.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, sure enough, he was right. So it doesn't, a lot of people, I think that the challenge can only be you're challenging something that was called that you don't think happened. But it doesn't have to be. As long as you have a description of what it is you want challenged, you can challenge anything.
Yeah. I mean, definitely, I think that that kind of rule, like coaches are trying to figure out how to really use that. And I think Bob Stoops used that to exactly what it needed to be to a T. And I've seen other coaches will use that challenge. I'm like, well, they've already seen it in the booth. You're challenging
Mm-hmm.
something that they already just looked at and you just lost it for no reason. But I mean,
Well, the other thing too to that is the onus and the responsibility is also on the other coaching staff members that are in the booth or do have that tablet on the sideline to very quickly, if there's something in question, somebody needs to get to that head coach and say, "Hey, don't challenge it. We're not going to get it." Or, "Coach, challenge it. This is a no-brainer." Blah blah
yeah,
blah. If you don't have that quick back and forth, that can cause a problem, right? Because and we've seen that happen with some head coaches where we're listening into them and we're listening into the different coaches, and the head coach decides to challenge it, and nobody on the staff said, "Coach, don't do it, don't challenge it." And I think we're seeing more and more of that now, as far as a total responsibility on behalf of the coaching staff to help the head coach before he makes the call.
Mm. So you're a mainstream sports guy. I mean, we call this the alt football space, your arena football leagues and the XFL and
Mm-hmm.
stuff. How is the mainstream sports kind of perceiving the XFL? I mean, we basically made it to week 10 and we'll get to the playoffs and finish the season. We're
Sure.
already talking about season tickets for year 2. So what's the mainstream consensus about the XFL?
That it's been very entertaining. It's been very well received. I think the ratings have reflected that by and large, to sustain over the course of 10, 11, 12 weeks. Some stability there is really, really encouraging. I think the fans, like I said earlier, they can't get enough of the audio. The way I describe it is the audio is the bouncing ball. Okay. We as broadcasters, unlike broadcasting a college football game or an NFL game, we need to follow that bouncing ball, but never get ahead of it, in the sense that the audio is going to drive the broadcast. And what we hear when that audio is done, then we can chime in and give some perspective. So, for example, if I hear a coach give a quarterback something and I know what that is, I'm not going to just jump in right away. I'm going to let that thing play itself out. And then on the back end and say, hey, here's what you could look for. Maybe illustrate something here and there. The feedback I've gotten from people who've watched it and enjoyed it has really been the coach to quarterback interaction, and then having the broadcasters to be able to give a little bit more clarity into detail as to what we maybe see coming in this next play, what they're trying to look for, and things of that nature. So that's probably been the part that I think's been most well received. And the other thing too is, you got Seattle hoping to get a win this week, and then St. Louis hoping to get a win this week. Then you got all kinds of
Yeah.
tiebreaker scenarios that we're all trying to look into and figure out right now. And I have Seattle this week, so they need St. Louis to lose to Orlando. But you're going to have DC playing host, got the unbelievable venue, and to see a venue like that and how well it's been received and what their fan base has done, I think it just goes to show you the validity and the credibility that the league has created, because they keep coming back and they keep building a bigger beer snake, and they
Yeah.
keep making lemon signs when you tried to take their beer snake away. And then, you look at all the Battlehawks fans and, and how that thing has unfolded. So I think it's been really well received. It's been a lot of fun, and it's been a league whose primary goal, in my opinion, is to put the fan first. The fan
Mm.
experience is what has to trump everything else.
So what about the players? Because you have a background in scouting stuff. What are
Mm-hmm.
the scouts kind of saying about XFL players? I mean, if you heard, anybody being like, hey, these 3 guys are definitely going to be on NFL rosters, and are they
Yeah.
already talking about who's could be making their jump to the NFL?
Yeah, I think so. And there's going to be a handful of players. A lot of the answer to that question depends on a couple of things. Number one, how old is the player? Number two, how many years vested in the NFL? If he's already played in the NFL, does he have? That could coincide with age as well, because you can age yourself out of the league and price yourself out of the league. And both of those make it difficult to get back in. So
Interesting.
let's just say you made an active roster for 4 years, but you're only 27 years old. Well, you got a lot of fuel left in the tank, right? You're trying to get back. Well, you're an ideal candidate for the XFL, because now all of a sudden you're going to play a lot more. You have NFL experience, and maybe you're still young enough to help a football team. And then you're going to have 2 guys come to mind. John Trey Kirkland at Houston, who ended up getting hurt about midway through the season, and then Abram Smith at DC.
Hmm.
2 players that, if you haven't, or you're not familiar with John Trey Kirkland, he's on the same team with, Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase,
Yeah.
and he wasn't the primary guy. Didn't mean he wasn't a great player. He ended up being the most dynamic player up until getting injured that this league had. I mean, I look at him, as a guy that he signs an NFL contract, I would be really surprised if he doesn't make an active roster or at least initially a practice squad. And then you've got a guy who's young like Abram Smith, who NFL scouts will get excited about because he doesn't have a lot of mileage on the chassis, right? He was a linebacker his first 3 years at Baylor, played running back his senior year, rushed for 1,600 yards. He's got a lot of upside to continue to develop as a back, as opposed to the guy that comes out of college and that's all he's been doing since he was 12 years old. So I know there's some excitement about him. And I think once the season is done, all of those scouting departments at the National Football League level will dissect each and every one of those players and each and every one of those teams to see if they can find a fit, to see if they can find a guy that they think could maybe make their team this time around, or that was so close 2 years ago, and now all of a sudden these 10 games may really help them. And that's the purpose of the league, right? I mean, that's what we want to see. These coaches in this league, if they selfishly, they'd like to have their best players back. Unselfishly, they don't want to see them come back, because that would show that the league is working, it's serving its purpose, because there's always going to be plenty of really good football players out there that are more than capable of playing at a high level in professional football outside of the NFL. So replacing those guys isn't the challenge. That's something you can do, but you want them to have the opportunity to move on.
Gotcha. All right, two final questions. One, has there been chatter in ESPN as far as what season 2 might bring, or is there anybody talk about that, or even what ESPN might be doing for the off season when it comes to the XFL? We've heard Danny Garcia kind of talk about this year-round thing, and we haven't heard much about the partnership. Any plans during this off season?
To my knowledge, I have none, and I wouldn't be privy to those conversations. What I would say is that just like we would do on a coaching staff at the completion of a season, you're going to go back and you're going to self-scout, right? You're going to take stock and you're going to examine the operation that you announced 2.5 years ago. And then what did we do right? What could we correct? Where could we be better? Where did we miss? And focus on those things first, and then worry about everything else once you've ironed that out. So in terms of, are they going to be having players on teams, doing things in the off season to become ambassadors for their respective teams and cities? I have not heard any of that. I would not know. So I just know that there's excitement, and there has been each and every week, because I think everybody feels like it's going really, really well.
That's good. And then, so final question, put you on the spot. Who is the team? Who do you think is going to be in the championship game, and who do you think has the possibility to win it all? I think DC is definitely exposed. I mean, they almost lost twice at home. So what's your take?
Seattle's the team to worry about if they get in. They got the most explosive players on offense, the best wide receiving core, but they're also dangerous in a negative way because Ben DiNucci turns the ball over a lot, and when you start playing playoff and championship football, that's going to be problematic. The thing that's made DC so good all year long, and it's outside of their one loss to Orlando, is they've not played in a game where they've made more mistakes than the other team. Like the other team has generally found a way to screw it up. And on that one night against Orlando, in a game that I had, DC finally had that game, right? They hadn't done it all year long. And so if they get back on track, they're the most difficult team to contend with. And I think there's really one primary reason for that, and that is they run a college offense. Like when you watch them, they are so dramatically different than everybody else in the league, because you have to defend quarterback run, not one quarterback, but two of them. And in professional football, you rarely have to contend with that. That's not something that is a problem, or that you deal with on a week in and week out basis. When you play DC and you're playing defense, you have to deal with that on a play in and a play out basis, a series in, series out basis. So they would still be my favorite, but I think the matchup that would create the biggest challenges for them would be if Seattle played them in the North Division Championship.
There you go. All right, Tom, appreciate your time so much. So what game you calling on this weekend?
Seattle and Vegas, in Seattle. So it's interesting. My first game of the year, we had Seattle. I haven't seen them since. Second game of the year, we had Vegas. Have not seen them since. So diving back into the tape a little bit and looking forward to it. And it was neat to see, for our selfish purposes of the broadcast, to see Seattle get that win last week. So this game on Sunday for Seattle has huge implications.
And you get to explain all the tiebreaker stuff to all the fans out there
Oh
with the
my
up and
goodness.
on the. We were trying to figure out here.
I was just texting our producer, and we were kind of talking about what we were going to come up with in our open and what we wanted to talk about. And I said, whatever you do, whoever's doing graphics this week, let's make sure we got all the scenarios laid out, man, because we can try to memorize them and figure out point differential and all this and that. But if we could just put it on screen, that will help everybody.
All right. Great. Tom Luginbill, thanks so much from ESPN, and I appreciate you taking the time to be on the show.
You bet, man. Thanks for having me.